Today, we're going to break down and dissect the behavior of President Joe Biden during his interview with George Stephanopoulos. And Greg's picked out a few videos for us to watch. Greg, what do you got?
Yeah, quite simply, this is a 22-minute video that I pull 7 clips from, tried to keep those very coherent, so you get a question and a response. And it might be one of the most meaningful things we've seen with Joe Biden in a while.
Mr. President, thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the debate. You and your team have said you had a bad night, but your friend Nancy Pelosi actually framed the question that I think is on the minds of millions of Americans. Was this a bad episode or the sign of a more serious condition?
It was a bad episode. No indication of any serious condition. I was exhausted. I didn't listen to my instincts in terms of preparing, and a bad night.
You know, you say you were exhausted, and I know you've said that before as well, but you came, and you did have a tough month, but you came home from Europe about 11 or 12 days before the debate, spent 6 days in Camp David. Why wasn't that enough rest time, enough recovery time?
Because I was sick. I was feeling terrible. Matter of fact, the docs with me, I asked if they did a COVID test because they were trying to figure out what was wrong. They did a test to see whether or not I had some infection, a virus. I didn't. They just had a really bad cold.
And did you ever watch the debate afterwards?
I don't think I did, no.
Well, what I want to get at is what were you experiencing as you were going through the debate? Did you know how badly it was going?
Yeah, look, the whole way I prepared, nobody's fault mine. Nobody's fault but mine. I prepared what I usually would do, sitting down, as I did come back with foreign leaders or the National Security Council, for explicit detail. And I realized about partway through that, I get quoted, the New York Times had me down at 10 points before the debate, 9 now, or whatever the hell it is. The fact of the matter is that what I looked at is that he also lied 28 times. The way the debate ran, not my fault, no one else's fault. No one else's fault.
All right, Greg, what do you got?
Yeah, this is an interesting one to watch because I always have said there are 2 Joe Bidens. One is now look, and it's the televangelist shooting right down the screen. The other is a come on man. The come on man, the hands come up and he's like, come on, you got to be kidding me. This is Joe Biden in the now look, but it's a diminished version of it. I'm going to start off by saying I'm no doctor. I'm no neurologist. I've been exposed to loved ones who have dementia and Parkinson's. My family, Parkinson's, is a lot of it there. Not saying he's got that, but I'm just going to say you can see people diminish. And you don't need to have a degree or be a body language person to be able to figure out when somebody's diminished. You know it. I've watched people age and lose capacity over time. And I always say I danced with the one that brung me, so I'm going to talk about his body language, his behavior, and deviations. We've been watching this guy for 50 years. We got a pretty good baseline of who he is. This is a diminished version of that now look, and you can see it. When we're talking about baseline, sometimes when you're looking for a baseline, it's difficult. It's, in this case, I think if you got kids and you're trying to teach them to look for this, there's a great book I just picked up. And this book is Body Language Animated by Jim Pyle. And if you know Jim is one of the best questioners in the business. And this will teach kids to look for what's normal and what's not normal for that person, not any of this crap about touching your nose means you're lying or any of that kind of stuff. So I think it's a good book. And if you got kids in your life, it's one that you should use to get them to understand what we mean when we say baseline. Now, when I say this is a diminished version, we know that Joe Biden does a few things. That smile is what I would call a multi-use tool, kind of a Swiss Army knife. So he uses it when he's confused to delay. He uses it when he has no ready response to delay. When he scores a point with somebody, he uses his teeth that same way, that smile. So it's a pause tool for him. This guy's been in, like I say, he's been in politics since the 3rd quarter of the 20th century. So we got a lot of stuff. He shows engagement of these muscles at the center of the eyes, and that shows concern whenever he's saying it was a bad night. And he's got this little arch. Mark, you're going to talk about it, I'm sure, but when you're talking to a guy who has diminished, what you're probably going to do best is give him short, canned responses, nothing rambling. And he does that when he does a really good job of saying, I had a bad night. It's an anchor place for him to come back. We're going to see a lot of people who say because he's looking off to his right that he's got a deep embed earpiece. I don't think that's what it is. I think he's going to his recall for what was said to him because we see it at key times. And if you've ever had an earpiece in your ear and you're talking and hearing something at the same time, you got to be pretty sharp to stay on top of that. And I don't think that's who the guy is. We can see that he's prepared when he does that. Now look, and he brings both hands up. And you can see that he starts to ramble, and then he goes back to pick those hands up and say, Trump lied 28 times. That's prepared information, short, canned things. We saw this very thing when he did State of the Union. It was strung together, a whole bunch of things he does well, and those neural pathways are still alive. Scott, what do you got?
All right. Well, he looks a lot different now than he did in his during the debate. He looks a little bit different. I think he's rested, so that's a big part of it. But his face looks a little more puffy to me. It looks a little full compared to what he looked like before. His blank stare is still there, not the whole time though, and he's moving very stiff. His illustrators are stiff. When he's moving around, it's kind of stiff. There's nothing smooth about this at all. And then he's holding a pen. So I don't know what the story is on that. It's probably to help him not fidget around as much or give him something to do. So if he starts fidgeting around. And the first words with that first answer, things are kind of smushed together. He kind of rushes that, and they sound kind of not stuck together, but smushed together. And then after George says 11 to 12 days before the debate, you spent 6 days. And then if you look really closely at the left side of his mouth, some spit rolls out right there. Now, quite often when you're dealing with someone that has dementia or especially Parkinson's, they'll take cholinesterase inhibitor. And that's one of the things that is the side effects of that are you drool a little bit. And we'll see it a couple of times in here as we go through. Another thing is his illustrators, when he does illustrate, they're really small, except when he does the big regulators, when he's like Greg's talking about, when he starts going into something that he's already prepared for and he's got already loaded in the chamber and ready to go, then he'll start getting his illustrators up really big. But the largest thing we see as we go through this, his biggest movements at all come in those regulators where he's trying to say, that's not why, it's my fault, those kind of things. So let's pay attention to that. My wife is a private investigator, and I asked her, how do you find out so much information about these people you're looking into? And she said, the internet, Google. And that's because data brokers sell your information to scammers, spammers, and anybody else who wants to target you. Your full name, your email address, your home address, your health records, your relatives, it's all out there. That's why I've been using Aura, the sponsor of today's video. Aura shows me which data brokers are selling my information and automatically submits opt-out requests for me. I don't have to do anything. So I used Aura to find out how many of these data brokers are selling my information. I couldn't believe it. Cleaning up my information not only helps reduce the amount of spam I get, but it helps protect me from hackers who could use that information to help them get access to my social media accounts, bank accounts, or other sensitive information. Aura also does so much more to protect me and my family from online threats I can't even see. With Aura, I get other features like antivirus, VPN, password management, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and more without having to download a bunch of apps. It's really easy to use, especially for somebody like me who's not a technical person, and I get everything for one affordable price. You may have one or two of these tools already, but not having Aura is like locking the front door but leaving the back door wide open. Aura is always on, doing the hard work keeping me safe so I can focus on other things and not have to worry about all that kind of stuff. I value my privacy, and I value yours. You can go to aura.com/TBP to start your free 2-week trial. That's aura.com/TBP, and there's a link for that in the description below. Mark, what do you got?
Yeah, so here's what interests me about this is none of us here can really say whether he has dementia. And you sitting there, you can't say whether he has dementia. Only a doctor examining with a specialization would be able to do that. But it doesn't really matter, because the thing is that his only job here is to convince us in whatever way that he is fit to govern. That was his job back at that debate, to prove that he's fit to govern, to give no reason why we might go, you know what, I'm unsure. Because all of us, really, the voters, and if you can vote out there, you're a layperson, you're on the whole not going to be a specialist. So all we need is just enough information to go, you know what, I'm feeling comfortable about this, it's all right, it's going to be okay. So that's his job there, and it's the job of his team around him, the communication team, of which I've been part of for other presidents, other prime ministers, other leaders. It's their job to set him up in the right place to do that job for people. Let's see how he does. Well, first of all, his breathing rate is up quite high. Just breathe along with him. Watch it and breathe along. And you sitting there, comfortable and calm like him and breathing at that rate, how are you feeling? Does that feel calm to you? And if he is calm, why does it have that accelerated rate? What might be happening in his mind or his body in order to create that accelerated rate? For that breathing rate as well, he's also what I would call devoiced. There's not a lot of air passing across his vocal cords. Now, we know he can be really quite ranty, quite shouty, and does it actually quite well. We've seen him out doing stump speeches in front of big audiences, and he's got a lot of volume. But in this place right now, his breathing rate is high, and not very much of it is getting across his vocal cords. So he seems stressed and his voice seems devoiced and weak. Now, why is that? I'm not going to speculate why that is, but it isn't the look that he should be going for right now to convince us he's fit to govern. Here's what he said. There's a question there. Did you ever watch the debate afterwards? Clear question. Did you ever watch the debate afterwards? Here's his answer. I don't think I did. No. I don't think I did. No. Well, if you're trying to convince us, I don't know why he says, I don't think I did. I would hope that you would know if you've watched it or you didn't watch it, and you'd be able to say, yes, I watched it, or no, I didn't watch it. But to say, I don't think I did, no, doesn't give you the right optic when you're trying to convince a public that you are fit to govern. If you can't remember that, then that's got to be an issue. Now, maybe you can remember it and he doesn't want to say so. He's going to be inaccurate about that. But you're going to need to be accurate or inaccurate. You're going to have to give a forceful answer because the whole world is watching you going, are you fit to govern or not? And already in the first few frames of this, it's not the right look. It's not the look he should be going for. Chase, what do you got on this one?
Yeah, I agree with you all. And if you're maybe just recently discovering this channel, we don't ever compare notes. We don't look at each other's notes or talk about this before. Scott has to stop us because we'll be BSing before we start filming. So if we ever disagree, then we disagree. And I think it becomes a lot more powerful when four people with at minimum 20,000, 30,000 hours of experience in this field come together and do something like this. So y'all talked about a lot of what was in my notes. So let's go into I'm going to spend this whole video going into the kind of the neuroscience side of this. I have postgraduate certifications in neuroscience and medical neuroscience. And I want to talk about the paused facial expressions, how you'll see him make a facial expression and it hangs there on his face for longer than it might feel like it should while he's listening. This is not in his baseline in the previous decades that he's spent on camera, including the interviews that he's done just 5 years ago. This is called affect dysregulation, and it's one of the hallmarks of several cognitive decline disorders. Young and Butler studied this in 2019, if you want to look up the research, and a really cool study using AI facial expression reading, and showed that it was able to detect cognitive impairment by detecting this type of behavior before even family members might pick it up. So people showed a decline in the variability of facial expressions like we're seeing here. And in 2015, Jones and Boyle, I can't remember the publication, I think Psychiatry, but they published a great paper on this discussing reduced emotionality and prolonged facial expressions in cognitive decline. There's probably no less than 100 papers that talk about this, but there's not many people where you can go back through decades and watch them on camera to compare. This is one of them. So this is a very rare case where that's possible. But he then he says one thing in here that I was like, whoa, wait. He says they were testing me to see if I had some kind of virus, but it was just a cold. I think a cold's a virus. But the whole second half of this clip is a deviation from his baseline based on years of video that anybody can look through. If you listen, there's not really one full coherent thought or sentence here. when just previously, even sometimes during the previous election cycle, he was sharp, he was well spoken and fluent and lucid, and he could complete sentences without starting a new one in the middle. So verbal fluency is one of the most common and reliable ways to detect MCI, or mild cognitive impairment. And I think all the other forms of cognitive decline can be measured using verbal fluency. And they typically refer to this in research as what's called novel verbal fluency. Can I make new sentences instead of reciting the alphabet or the Pledge of Allegiance? That's why they call it that. So there are so many studies on this that prove this that I wouldn't know where to start citing people. But if you want to start looking into this, maybe for your own family, start with Sutton and Stephan. And this was published in International Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry in 2019, a pretty recent study.
Mr. President, thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the debate. You and your team have said you had a bad night, but your friend Nancy Pelosi actually framed the question that I think is on the minds of millions of Americans. Was this a bad episode or the sign of a more serious condition?
It was a bad episode. No indication of any serious condition. I was exhausted. I didn't listen to my instincts in terms of preparing, and I had a bad night.
You know, you say you were exhausted, and I know you've said that before as well, but you came, and you did have a tough month, but you came home from Europe about 11 or 12 days before the debate, spent 6 days in Camp David. Why wasn't that enough rest time, enough recovery time?
Because I was sick. I was feeling terrible. Matter of fact, the docs with me, I asked if they did a COVID test because they were trying to figure out what was wrong. They did a test to see whether or not I had some infection, a virus. I didn't. They just had a really bad cold.
And did you ever watch the debate afterwards?
I don't think I did, no.
Well, what I want to get at is what were you experiencing as you were going through the debate? Did you know how badly it was going?
Yeah, look, the whole way I prepared, nobody's fault mine. Nobody's fault but mine. I prepared what I usually would do, sitting down, as I did come back with foreign leaders or the National Security Council, for explicit detail. And I realized about partway through that, I get quoted, the New York Times had me down at 10 points before the debate, 9 now, or whatever the hell it is. The fact of the matter is that what I looked at is that he also lied 28 times. The way the debate ran, not my fault, no one else's fault. No one else's fault.
But it seemed like you were having trouble from the first question in, even before he spoke.
Well, I just had a bad night. You've had some bad interviews once in a while. I can't remember any, but I'm sure you did.
I've had plenty. I guess the problem is here for a lot of Americans watching is you've said, going back to 2020, watch me. Yep. To people who are concerned about your age. And, 50 million Americans watched that debate. It seemed to confirm fears they already had.
Well, look, after that debate, I did 10 major events in a row, including till 2 o'clock in the morning after that debate. I did events in North Carolina. I did events in Georgia. Did events like this today. Large crowds, overwhelming response, no slipping. And so I just had a bad night. I don't know why.
And how quickly did it come to you that you were having that bad night?
Well, it came to me as having a bad night when I realized that even when I was answering a question, even though they turned his mic off, he was still shouting. And I let it distract me. I'm not blaming it on that. But I realized that I just wasn't in control.
All right. Chase, what do you got?
I'll be short on this. I'd like to understand why somebody thought this kind of damage control was a good idea. And this is on a media that for the past 4 years has been very supportive of President Biden. It's interesting. And I'd love to see Dr. Phil do an interview with President Biden on Merritt Street Media, where he interviewed President Trump and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I think that what he said in this clip, that after the debate on the same night, he had a great night until 2 o'clock in the morning. If this is true, then how could having a cold be the reason for the bad night? I would assume the cold would still be there. Maybe I'm wrong. Mark, I'm curious as to your opinion, if you could, about this type of damage control, and why would somebody who's managing him or teaching him have him or ask him to do this, something like this?
It depends how much control they actually have. And that can be the issue, is just the communications team, just what control they have of their principal, and also the machine around him. Are they there for the president? Are they there for the party? Who's the employer? Who's giving the commands around this? So I don't know, but I do know from my own experience that it can get very tricky, because sometimes you're in between your client and the party, and they want one thing and your client wants another thing. And around elections, there's a lot of grassroots as well as a lot of amateur action that goes on as well. So it's a little bit tricky there. Look, let me continue, Chase, and give you my notes on this. Here's what I know is happening here from the communications team. I just had a bad night. How many times? Go through again and count the amount of times that you hear from Biden and the interviewer, I just had a bad night. This is what we call normalizing, socializing, and prioritizing the message. So normalizing it, just had a bad night. I mean, you've had a bad night. We've all had a bad night. That socializes it as well. I mean, we're all part of the group of people who just have a bad night. It's normal and it's social to do that. And then we prioritize it. We go, and having a bad night, I mean, it doesn't really mean very much. It's not a lot in the grand scheme of things. What our priorities are, and then you move to the new message of here's what the people really want. Here's what my priorities are. So, not only Biden, but the interviewer is on message. Biden says bad night. Interviewer says bad night. Biden says bad night again. It's that thing of, if you say it enough, it will become true. If you say it enough, it will become true. And that's what they're doing right now. Even go to the lower thirds on the TV screen, okay? And down below, bad night on the lower thirds as well. It's beautiful spin. I can't deny it. If I was doing that job, I would be happy at that moment. The amount of times bad night was repeated and it was in the lower thirds, I would be high-fiving my team going, that's what we were looking for. That's what we wanted there. Greg, what do you got on this one?
It's a great anchor point. And Chase, I want to reiterate something you said about novel communication difficulty. That's what we're seeing. I mean, I'm no neurologist. I don't need to be. Neither do you. We've all watched this guy. We have his baseline. We had his baseline 2 weeks before. We have his baseline after. If he had a bad night, okay. If my grandpa has a bad night and he goes home and sleeps it off, good. President of the United States. They always have bad nights. They always have tough times and stressful times. So that's why it matters so much. But let's talk about that. Where you talk about novel communication, he doesn't use it. We don't hear in any of this stuff. He's talking in very short, concise terms. He does a good job with had a bad night and a couple of others we're going to see. Anytime he's doing that, he can control the conversation. What he is masterful at is stringing together all things. Let me tell you, I went one time with my ex-wife to see her grandmother who was in a home where people had dementia. And the thing I remembered the most was there were two people in there. I'll just talk about one of them first. There was a lady who everything seemed normal with her. She'd been a professor at Vanderbilt, close to Scott, and she was talking to me, and she had wonderful conversations about her years in Vanderbilt and that kind of thing. And my ex-wife walked out of the room, and I said, "Hey, did you see where that tall blonde woman went?" And she said, "Oh yeah, she went out that door. And if you go out that door and you turn left, you'll be at Vanderbilt." Well, that is not healthy. And what I see in this is, as long as you're stringing together old sentences and old things from your past, kind of like the State of the Union, and you're doing that same political rhetoric, to your point, Mark, you tap into it, you give him political rhetoric to deliver. You see those hands come up, and you see the Vanderbilt lady. She's telling you all about Vanderbilt. So when you get to those hard points that he's there, what he does very well, George starts off by sounding like Biden's, come on, man. He's so plaintive trying to get him to answer the question. But Biden does an artful thing. He actually says, you've had some bad interviews, puts it back on his feet. There's a social interaction that shows his decades of ability to communicate with people and to build coalition and bonds and that kind of thing. And that is an old skill that's still alive and well in Joe Biden. We can see it. What I think is happening, and you guys who are smarter than me about, somebody will say it in the comments, can tell me the more pronounced a neural pathway is, the more it's going to survive the brain decay. So if I'll give you the other guy, he was walking through this home with a set of keys checking every door. And I said, sir, what's up? And he said, I got thousands of rugs in one of these rooms and I don't know where they are. Something he had done a million times. Those things stick with you. Whether they fit the situation or not, it's another story. So he also is very good at saying, I shouldn't give too much. I'm making no excuse. That's prep. I can hear it in his head. That's prep. No long talking points, short, concise, and to the point. There is, however, an interesting thing. He says that Trump was screaming even when his mic was off. Too bad. We had side by side. We saw it wasn't happening. So is he recalling the old debate last time where Trump did scream and yell and do all of that? Or is he did he slip a gear somewhere in here? I don't know, but it doesn't make him look good. It shows that when he's prepped, when he's doing that his hands are doing that old Joe thing, and he's doing the old Joe thing, things go well. When he gets to that point, back to you now, Chase, back to that novel communication is where it starts to fall apart. Scott, what do you got?
All right. Yeah, I agree with you. And believe it or not, his illustrators were pretty much right on point. They're not very big. They're not very fast. But when he does, they hit where they land where they should land, emphasizing that word or phrase that he's trying to emphasize. And I think that heavy breathing could be what's called respiratory dyskinesia. And that's caused by, most of the time in Parkinsonianism and dementia, by the drugs you take, the levodopa that you take on that. So that's one of the side effects. And the monotone hypophonia, that's where it almost sounds like he's whispering. That's never going to go away, because that is one of the side effects as well that's one of the first things that doctors look for, neurologists will look for in someone who they suspect has dementia or Alzheimer's, because they start that whisper, whatever they're writing gets real small, a bunch of red flags you look for, but those are two huge ones right there that we're looking at. Again, that his biggest thing is the regulator, where his hands come up and he says, but it's, here's what happened, not my fault, or whatever the thing is there. And you're right, Greg, when he's talking about the yelling after the mic's turned off, he's not yelling, but he's created that in his mind, I guess, as we always talk about that saying, every man must be the hero of his own story. Must necessarily be the hero of his own story, is a Kafka quote. And I think that's partially what he's doing here, because I don't know if he remembers all that happened. If he can't remember whether he watched the debate or not, that's pretty telling right there that something's up. So, all right, that's all I got. We good?
Well, and guys, I'm not even saying you have to have a disease for you to lose that kind of ability. People in my family live to be in their 90s, and they start to kind of trail off. That just happens to them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Can we lean in now, Greg?
Yes, you can lean in.
Thank you.
I was getting even with you.
But it seemed like you were having trouble from the first question in, even before he spoke.
Well, I just had a bad night. You've had some bad interviews once in a while. I can't remember any, but I'm sure you do.
I've had plenty. I guess the question, the problem is here for a lot of Americans watching, is you've said, going back to 2020, watch me. Yep. To people who are concerned about your age. And, 50 million Americans watched that debate. It seemed to confirm fears they already had.
Well, look, after that debate, I did 10 major events in a row, including till 2 o'clock in the morning after that debate. I did events in North Carolina. I did events in Georgia. I did events like this today. Large crowds, overwhelming response, no slipping. And so I just had a bad night. I don't know why.
And how quickly did it come to you that you were having that bad night?
Well, it came to me as having a bad night when I realized that even when I was answering a question, even though they turned his mic off, he was still shouting. And I let it distract me. I'm not blaming it on that. But I realized that I just wasn't in control.
Part of the other concern is that this seems to fit into a pattern of decline that has been reported on recently. New York Times had a headline on July 2nd, Biden's lapses are said to be increasingly common and worrisome. Here's what they wrote. People who have spent time with President Biden over the last few months or so said the lapses appear to have grown more frequent, more pronounced, and after Thursday's debate, more worrisome. By many accounts, as evidenced by video footage, observation, and interviews, Mr. Biden is not the same today as he was even when he took office 3.5 years ago. Similar reporting in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. Are you the same man today that you were when you took office 3.5 years ago?
In terms of successes, yes. I also was the guy who put together a peace plan for the Middle East that may be coming to fruition. I was also the guy that expanded NATO. I was also the guy that grew the economy. All the individual things that were done were ideas I had or I fulfilled. I moved on. And so, for example, well, that was true then. What's Biden done lately? Today, just announced 200,000 new jobs. We're moving in a direction that no one's ever taken on. I know you know this from the days in the government. I took on Big Pharma. I beat them. No one said I could beat them. I took on all the things we said we got done. We were told we couldn't get done. And part of it is what I said when I ran was I wanted to do three things. Restore some decency to the office, restore some support for the middle class instead of trickle-down economics, go from the middle out and the bottom up. That way the wealthy still do fine, everyone does better, and unite the country.
But what has all that work over the last 3.5 years cost you physically, mentally, emotionally?
Well, I just think it cost me a really bad night, a bad run. But, George, I'm optimistic about this country. I don't think we're a country of losers, as he points out. I don't think America's in tough shape. I think America's on the cusp of breaking through in so many incredible opportunities. This next term, I'm going to make sure we have straighten out the tax system. I'm going to make sure we're in a situation where we have health care for all people, where we're in a position where we have child care and elder care, free up, and all these things. The one thing I'm proudest of is, remember when my economic plan was put forward, a lot of the mainstream economists said it's not going to work. Well, guess what? You now have 16 Nobel laureates, 16 of them in economics, saying that Biden's next term would be, based on what he wants to do, enormous success. Trump's plan would cause a recession, would significantly increase inflation. I've made great progress, and that's what I plan on doing, and we can do this.
I understand.
All right, Mark, what do you got?
While we were watching that clip, I just copied his breathing then, just for probably about 6 breaths. Because I was hyperventilating. I don't like the breathing. I don't know why. Scott, you could be right. You could be right. Could be some medication he's taking. Could be something else. I don't know the answer to this. All I know is when I do it, I don't feel good. It's too much. It's too much for me sitting here. So I'm concerned about that. And why I'd be concerned about that as a communicator is I know that the audience mirror the breathing of the speaker. They do it unconsciously. So I would know I've got a whole audience who I need to convince to vote for this guy or change their mind or stick with their idea and convince them that he's fit to rule. And they're feeling upset by this because they're mirroring his breathing. Not good. I would say I'd go in for a closer shot, but I'm not even sure I want a closer shot on this. I don't know what to do in this situation. Keep cutting to the interviewer. The more we see the interviewer, the better, maybe. Scott, you picked up on this, but the pen in his hand. Now, why is that? There is some paper next to him. Maybe he was making some notes. I'm going to theorize that actually he looks better with a pen in his hand. It gives him a tool. It gives him a tool of intelligence. You have to be switched on in order to write. It's only us humans that can write. Only us can do that language piece and write, and we're that dexterous. Monkey is never going to do it. Elephant's never going to do it. Yeah, never going to manage this amount of dexterousness. They can't use tools like we use tools. So I think, and we see him swap hands with the tools. And I think, Trump has got that lovely kind of pinch gesture that he does in order to go, look, I can use fine tools. Look how good I am, how dexterous I am. Fine tools. Look at that. And I think it's an advantage for Biden to have that pen in his hand and go, look, I can use fine tools. That's all I've got on that one. But still, all of it telling. Scott, what do you got on this one?
All right. This is sort of the structure of his answers that have been set up, because he'll say something or give the answer, then he starts campaigning. That's really all that's going on here. This is little softball things for him to go in there, and he gives a short answer that may answer the question. Most of the time it doesn't. Then goes on like Chase was talking about. It's talking about nothing, has nothing to do with what's actually been asked there. So again, his illustrators are stiff. Everything is, he looks relaxed because he's sitting back the way he is. And the pen, I think you're right, Mark, about that. I think that helps him. It helps with the look of the whole thing. It looks like he's got something going on outside of what's happening. It's like the Pope in the pool theory when you're talking about making videos, or on TikTok and Instagram and things, how they keep your attention. And when George says, "What is all this work cost you?" Then he does it again. He does a short answer and then goes on this little campaign thing. That's all I could really pull out of that, other than the things we've talked about so far. Chase, what do you got?
Yeah, let's talk about these patterns that you're talking about. And we have a word for what's happening here in our line of work, and we call this a resume statement. And a resume statement is when somebody answers a question by telling you all the good things about themselves. And that's what we're hearing here. And that's his, when he does this, he says, George asks him, are you the same guy who took office 3 years ago, give or take? I'm paraphrasing. He says, yes, in terms of successes, I'm the same guy. And then he goes into this huge resume statement about his accomplishments. And at the end of this clip, you can hear George getting frustrated. President Biden isn't answering not any of these questions. And I'm not sure if it's deliberate. And I think what you can recognize when this clip comes back on is somebody who has a memorized skill. Like Greg was talking about, these neurons that are hardwired. If you want to look that up, it's called Hebb's postulate. If you want to go look up that theory about that stuff. He spent his whole life in politics. So he, just like any politician on either side of the aisle, has learned to redirect back to what he wants to talk about. But we're seeing a skill he's honed over decades in politics being used inappropriately here. He's using the same skill in inappropriate ways without answering questions and not looking very confident doing it. And in 2015, there was a study that was published by R.H. Messer talking about this, how cognitive decline affects language use and social interactions. So social cues and the use of pragmatic language declines over time. And again, this is a rare case where there's an open vault of thousands of hours of video to go back and compare verbal fluency and social responses to. And his social responses here to George in this clip are almost zero compared to 3 years ago. Just his eyebrow flashes, his nodding, his actual connection to the person. And even with, people make these gaffe compilations and stuff, even with those several years ago, there was far greater response to people socially. And you can see it mostly in how do people react to Joe Biden. When he's up on stage, how do people react to him? So his ability to cause a social and nonverbal reaction in other people was really high back then, and it's not there now. People don't react to him. So this is a charismatic trait that he had. He was a very charismatic dude. We're not seeing that here. We're not seeing that social resonance is what this is called in psychology, if you want to look that up. Greg, what do you got?
Yeah, I think most politicians are like roaches when the lights come on. They've got a bunch of little canned things they do, and they just blast those out. That's how they take control of the conversation and redirect the conversation. They don't chaff. they redirect and then chaff is typically what they do. They get off the subject and they distance as far from it as they can. And I don't think it takes them any work. I watch them all the time, critique them on the news, red and blue, don't care. They're all doing it. And that's how they stay in office, because they got to keep 51% of the people happy. If you watch him, he's back to that thing. When he says a pattern of decline, when Stephanopoulos says there's a pattern of decline, the multi-use tool comes back, his Swiss Army knife, this smile, gives him a pause where he can do something. But then we see concern in his brow. We see the gripping of the sides of his brow. We also see the sides of his mouth narrow and draw. That's anger or frustration or something, some negative emotion. And then watch his jacket. To Mark, to your point, you'll hyperventilate if you do that for a solid minute. It's just he's rattling. I think he's angry. But the interesting piece is we don't see much of a blink rate increase when all that happens. And you guys can talk to that who are more on the neurological scale than I am. But it's interesting. Threat check for sure. Because look, George Stephanopoulos is not even looking up, but he's eye locked with him. And you see that eye contact. You know he's frustrated with this anger. I mean, this thing. Then he does that just outright redirect, to your point, Chase. He doesn't answer the question, anything to do about, are you capable? Well, look what I've done. Okay, that's good. That's good. When I was young, I was a fast runner. I'm not a fast runner now. That doesn't matter. How fast I ran the 2-miler doesn't affect whether I'm going to run from a bear right now. So he's running from a bear, and he needs to think about that. But when he does get over to that other stuff, he's back to that roach in the light. His legs are moving. He goes to good, clear, reminded answers, and his hands come up, and he's on message and clear. And one thing I will give Joe Biden, even though he probably shouldn't, many times he'll use statistics. Trump doesn't use statistics as often, and Biden will stumble over statistics. Sometimes I think it's a trigger for a stutter for him, and you'll see him clench his eyes as he goes into a stutter and come out. But he does use statistics. Whether they're accurate or not, that's up to somebody else to check. So we've watched him for this entire time using political rhetoric, using statistics, and using that hands up now look. And he goes into that baseline. You can see it when he goes restoring to the office for middle class. Somebody has prepped him really well, but Stephanopoulos doesn't let up. And he says, what does that cost you? And I love the fact he doesn't ask, he tells. What does that cost you? It's downtone, Mark, you always talk about. And he's driving to him. And then he starts to get lost, and he says, I'm proud of blah, blah, blah. You can hear he trails off, loses verbal fluency, to your point, Chase, but then comes back. I think this is how the guy did well on the State of the Union. It was canned phrases that were part of his roachy legs, and he just stood in front of the camera and delivered what was there. That's all I got.
Yeah. State of the Union, Greg, he also had auto cue there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That's a big deal. Yeah.
Which, he does really well. He does a great read, great read on auto cue. Better than
That's a good call out. Good call out, yeah.
Part of the other concern is that this seems to fit into a pattern of decline that has been reported on recently. New York Times had a headline on July 2nd, Biden's lapses are said to be increasingly common and worrisome. Here's what they wrote. People who have spent time with President Biden over the last few months or so said the lapses appear to have grown more frequent, more pronounced, and after Thursday's debate, more worrisome. By many accounts, as evidenced by video footage, observation, and interviews, Mr. Biden is not the same today as he was even when he took office 3.5 years ago. Similar reporting in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. Are you the same man today that you were when you took office 3.5 years ago?
In terms of successes, yes. I also was the guy who put together a peace plan for the Middle East that may be coming to fruition. I was also the guy that expanded NATO. I was also the guy that grew the economy. All the individual things that were done were ideas I had or I fulfilled. I moved on. And so, for example, well, that was true then. What's Biden done lately? Today, just announced 200,000 new jobs. We're moving in a direction that no one's ever taken on. I know you know this from the days in the government. I took on Big Pharma. I beat them. No one said I could beat them. I took on all the things we said we got done. We were told we couldn't get done. And part of it is what I said when I ran was I wanted to do 3 things. Restore some decency to the office, restore some support for the middle class instead of trickle-down economics, go from the middle out and the bottom up. That way the wealthy still do fine, everyone does better, and unite the country.
But what has all that work over the last 3.5 years cost you physically, mentally, emotionally?
Well, I just think it cost me a really bad night, a bad run. But, George, I'm optimistic about this country. I don't think we're a country of losers, that he points out. I don't think America's in tough shape. I think America's on the cusp of breaking through in so many incredible opportunities. This next term, I'm going to make sure we have straighten out the tax system. I'm going to make sure we're in a situation where we have health care for all people, where we're in a position where we have child care and elder care, free up, and all these things. The one thing I'm proudest of is, remember when my economic plan was put forward, a lot of the mainstream economists said it's not going to work. Well, guess what? You now have 16 Nobel laureates, 16 of them in economics, saying that Biden's next term would be, based on what he wants to do, enormous success. Trump's plan would cause a recession, would significantly increase inflation. I've made great progress, and that's what I plan on doing, and we can do this.
I understand. I understand that, and I'm not disputing that. What I'm asking you is about your personal situation. Do you dispute that there have been more lapses, especially in the last several months?
Can I run the 110 flat? No, but I'm still in good shape.
Are you more frail?
No.
I know you spoke.
Keep my schedule.
I know you spoke with your doctor after the debate. What did he say?
He said, he just looked at me and said, "You're exhausted." I said, "Look, I have medical doctors travel me everywhere, every president does, as you know. Medical doctors, some of the best in the world, travel me everywhere I go. I have an ongoing assessment of what I'm doing. And they don't hesitate to tell me if they think there's something wrong."
I know you said you have an ongoing assessment. Have you had a full neurological and cognitive evaluation?
I get a full neurological test every day with me. And I've had a full physical. I had, I've been able to read for my physicals. Yes, the answer is.
I know your doctor said he consulted with a neurologist. I guess I'm asking a slightly different question. Have you had the specific cognitive tests, and have you had a neurologist, a specialist, do an examination?
No one said I had to. No one said, they said I'm good.
Would you be willing to undergo an independent medical evaluation that included neurological and cognitive tests and release the results to the American people?
Look, I have a cognitive test every single day. Every day I have that test. Everything I do. Not only am I campaigning, but I'm running the world. And that's not how it sounds like hyperbole. But we are the essential nation in the world. Madeleine Albright was right. And every single day, for example, today, before I come out here, I'm on the phone with the Prime Minister of, anyway, I shouldn't get into detail, but with Netanyahu. I'm on the phone with the new Prime Minister of England. I'm working on what we're doing with regard to, in Europe, with regard to expansion of NATO and whether it's going to stick. I'm taking on Putin. Every day, there's no day I go through, there are not those decisions I have to make every single day.
And you have been doing that, and the American people have been watching, yet their concerns about your age and your health are growing. So that's why I'm asking, to reassure them, would you be willing to have the independent medical evaluation?
Watch me there's a lot of time left in this campaign. It's over 125 days.
So the answer,
make a decision.
The right answer right now is no, you don't want to do that right now.
No, I've already done it.
All right, Chase, what do you got?
So he, again, dodges the question about his health at the start. He's struggling to complete sentences. And George asks, would you be willing to undergo an independent cognitive test and release these to the American people? I'm paraphrasing that. His blink rate goes from a 13 to over 100 in less than 3 seconds. It's a huge flutter movement. Then there's a breathing rate increase. He starts breathing faster, and a breathing location shift. He shifts from abdomen to chest breathing, which we all do when we're very stressed out. And he does all this in response to the question about taking a cognitive test. The only thing that scares me in politics, and I'm no good at politics at all, I don't think either side has everybody's best interest at heart, and both sides suffer from weird corruption, is when anybody in politics says the government knows better than the people want. That's scary. to me. That's very scary. So anytime politicians view the government as a parent and not a servant to the people, I'm very scared. And this happens on both sides of the aisle. So this is obvious and crystal clear avoidance, redirection, and is back to Biden's actual baseline of using his traditional defense tactic, which is look, the word look followed by a resume statement to get out of trouble. Trump has a very similar one to get out of tough spots where he uses the interviewer's name and then says the word listen. And the same exact technique. And President Biden's facial expressions are still faded and hanging in place, like we talked about earlier. The technical term for this is called hypomemia. And we see this in clinical diagnostic textbooks of diagnosing Parkinson's and dementia and something called frontotemporal dementia and even a rarer condition called Lewy body dementia, which we're going to get into later. If we're looking at only what's observable, the reduced rearward arm swing when he's walking out on the stage, the increased shuffling in his gait, the increasing loss of fluency, the increase in reduced movement and motion, the facial expressions, the affect loss called hypomemia, and increasing spatial awareness challenges where he's kind of turning around. He's having to get help off the stage. If you watch the end of the debate, any clinician in the world who specializes in neurology, diagnostics would start thinking, just seeing this pile of stuff, would start thinking Parkinson's, Lewy body dementia, MSA, which is multiple system atrophy, or PSP, which is progressive supranuclear palsy, which causes all of these things. And if any doctor saw these symptoms, the next logical step for what I think, in my opinion, would be any doctor would be a cognitive testing, some kind of testing of cognitive capacity. Which is what they're asking about. This is exactly what George Stephanopoulos is asking about. Greg, what do you got?
Yeah, Stephanopoulos is trying to be respectful, but he's also irritated. You can't miss it. Look at his blink rate. We talk about blink rates. His goes through the roof, and he's emphatic. Those illustrators, he tries to make his point about the questions. And Biden, to your guys' point, responds with, hey, are you still together? I'm physical. I can wrestle a bear, whatever thing he goes to hyperbole. Then his hands are up at the doctors are traveling and ongoing assessment. Those are talking points. And if you want to know for sure that's a talking point, listen to his next words. I get a full neurological test every day, ... with me. That sums up what he just said in a more awkward sentence because he's trying to recall what he was told. And during that, he's got this request for approval, this forehead up, like we haven't seen to this point. And when he's saying they don't hesitate to tell me. If you pay attention to him, he tightens his eyes and opens his mouth. I've seen people do that when they're trying to be intent and listen, but it doesn't make you look very smart when you're sitting in front of people with your mouth open. So it's one of those things I keep saying. Had a deep in bed, somebody to say, hey, close your mouth, close your mouth. Really easy thing to do. That's why I keep saying I don't think he has one. When he's asked whether he'd be willing to take the test, watch his respiration increase too. You talk about his fluttering of his eyelids where he's dealing with stress. He does that a lot. We've seen it in his baseline, but his respiration's back up and his coat's opening. He comes back up to those talking points that he's got, back to rhetoric, running the world, and look at him. He looks like Joe Biden. This is back in his strong neural path. Then he says that I shouldn't get into the detail. That sounds like coaching to me, Mark. Does it sound like it to you? Then he stumbles and recovers with Netanyahu. And when he's on rhetoric, watch this guy and just, for whatever your politics are. I mean, I don't care what your politics are because you got a right to whatever you believe. That's all politics are, is a belief system. And if you believe that he's the guy, just ask yourself, why is he so different when he's asked a question versus doing rhetoric? And Chase, I think you were hitting on it in the beginning. This is that Vanderbilt lady all over again. As long as she's talking about what she did, she was cool. When I asked her where somebody went, now Vanderbilt's down the hall. That's irrational kind of thinking. And just pay attention to what he's doing here. It's weak. And this is 100 times better than the debate, in my opinion. But that's what it is. Scott, what do you got?
All right. Well, Chase, going back to what you were talking about, supranuclear palsy, I know somebody's got that and had it for a while. And that I agree with you on that because I don't think that's what this is, but it sure is following that little path of that.
Yeah.
Because supranuclear palsy is kind of like the ALS of Parkinson's, in other words, in a nutshell. If you look at it like that, the overall picture, it's the way I view it anyway. So yeah, some of those things are noticeable in there. One of the things that you usually notice with that before the onset, before you get diagnosed or anything else, is the eyes don't blink in unison. One will go and the other will go. They'll go like that. Now, it's common. A lot of people do that, and there's nothing wrong with you when you do that. But it starts happening quite often. And that's one of the first things you look for when you're diagnosing that, or you see that, you go, oh, and you start checking other things out as you go through the protocol of trying to find out what's wrong with that person. So yeah, I agree with you on a lot of that. There's a lot going on there. So, and when George says, do you dispute that there have been more lapses? He didn't even answer the question. He goes on to talk about how he's strong and all the things, he can't run as far as he used to and those kind of things. Doesn't answer the question. Goes again with that structure I was telling you about, where he answers a little bit of something, then goes on. He didn't even start there. Or sometimes he'll ask a question after he's been asked a question and answer that question. It's brilliant. What do you call that, Mark?
I guess it's being able to segue from one thing to another, be able to almost kind of lateral thinking, perhaps.
Oh, okay.
Let's call it self-interviewing.
Okay, that's a good
fuzzy
one.
logic.
Yeah, the self-interview. I like that. All right. But anyway, so these are prepared answers, and they got that back end just packed with political rhetoric, campaign rhetoric. And then he gives whatever status that he has of leadership. He gives that up when you ask him if he's had a cognitive test, and he says, nobody told me I needed to get one, or I had to get one. So that makes me wonder, who's in charge of telling him what to do? Who's driving? He should know that. He should say, hey, man, something's up. I just need to get this checked out. Or his wife should say, hey, man, something's up. What's wrong? They got a doctor right there in the White House. 24 hours a day, Cat can just walk in there and say, hey, something's up, man. Let's talk about this. And they'll talk to him about it.
Yeah.
That worries me. Mark, what do you got?
Yeah, I mean, it is important within any health system, whether it's private or it's public. You have to self-advocate for yourself, or really nothing will get you. Have all the money in the world, but if you're not advocating for yourself, nothing gets done. And we all know with cognitive decline that the patient is not a good advocate for themselves. You need somebody around who cares for them, who cares for themselves, who cares for the family, who wants to see the best for them, to advocate for them and to help them, step down sometimes, I would think, because it's not the right place for them. But look, that's not my decision. I'm not a family member. Stephanopoulos, I can see he's getting upset. He misses a trick, though, here. It's so important when you're interviewing to really listen to what people say and take time, or be faster with your thinking, to really try and understand where the possible entry points are for another question. Biden says, hesitate to tell. So the question is, so would you give me an example of when they've told you something is wrong? Because he's just admitted that they've told him something is wrong. Now, hey, he might go, yeah, I had a really bad tummy, and they said, hey, you got a bacterial infection, and they told me immediately. Like, he could give an example that is, non-lethal in some kind of way. But Stephanopoulos did not pick up on what essentially was a confession there and an entry point in there. So I'm going to go back to what you picked up there, Greg, which is, the question is, have you had a full neurological cognitive evaluation? He says, I have, ... I get a full neurological test every day, ... with me. So he starts with one idea, I have. He doesn't complete that. He goes into, I get a full neurological test every day. Okay, that's interesting if that's true. ... with me. Okay, there's many ideas in there, and it's not until later that we find out what he's done there is actually a brilliant bit of spin, in my view. It's really clever what he's done there, or what his communications team has given him there, which he didn't quite put together, didn't quite say it as fluently as he could. He says, I have a cognitive test every day. everything I do. What he's saying is being the president is the greatest cognitive test ever, and he's president, so he's passed. Every day he's saying, I'm given, every day. It could be, nuclear disaster. I've got to deal with Russia. I got to deal with Ukraine. I got to deal with Europe. I've got to deal with the homeland security. I've got to deal with the economics. I've got to deal with everything. And do you think somebody who wasn't cognitively sharp wouldn't be able to pass that test every day? It's a brilliant idea. Of course, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but it allows him to say, I have a cognitive test every day. It allows him to get those words out. And if you're not listening carefully, you'd say to your friend, well, he said he has a cognitive test every day and he's passing it. So I'm good. I'm not changing my vote, or I'm going to vote for him, because look at the other guy. I'm good. He has a cognitive test every day. He didn't say that. He says the job of being the president is the greatest cognitive test you can ever have. And he's president. So de facto, he must be passing it. That's not logical, but it is a wonderful piece of spin. And my hat goes off to the communications team on that one. It was very nice. Not delivered well, not delivered deftly, but a very nice piece there. That's all I got on that one.
I understand that, and I'm not disputing that. What I'm asking you is about your personal situation. Do you dispute that there have been more lapses, especially in the last several months?
Can I run the 110 flat? No, but I'm still in good shape.
Are you more frail?
No.
I know you spoke.
Keep my schedule.
I know you spoke with your doctor after the debate. What did he say?
He said, he just looked at me and said, you're exhausted. I said, look, I have medical doctors travel me everywhere, every president does, as you know. Medical doctors, some of the best in the world, travel me everywhere I go. I have an ongoing assessment of what I'm doing. And they don't hesitate to tell me if they think there's something wrong.
I know you said you have an ongoing assessment. Have you had a full neurological and cognitive evaluation?
I get a full neurological test every day with me. And I've had a full physical. I had, I've been able to read for my physicals. Yes, the answer is.
I know your doctor said he consulted with a neurologist. I guess I'm asking a slightly different question. Have you had the specific cognitive tests, and have you had a neurologist, a specialist, do an examination?
No one said I had to. No one said, they said I'm good.
Would you be willing to undergo an independent medical evaluation that included neurological and cognitive tests and release the results to the American people?
Look, I have a cognitive test every single day. Every day I have that test. Everything I do. Not only am I campaigning, but I'm running the world. And that's not how it sounds like hyperbole. But we are the essential nation in the world. Madeleine Albright was right. And every single day, for example, today, before I come out here, I'm on the phone with the Prime Minister anyway, I shouldn't get into detail, but with Netanyahu. I'm on the phone with the new Prime Minister of England. I'm working on what we're doing with regard to, in Europe, with regard to expansion of NATO and whether it's going to stick. I'm taking on Putin. Every day, there's no day I go through, there are not those decisions I have to make every single day.
And you have been doing that, and the American people have been watching, yet their concerns about your age and your health are growing. So that's why I'm asking, to reassure them, would you be willing to have the independent medical evaluation?
Watch me there's a lot of time left in this campaign. It's over 125 days.
So the answer,
make a decision.
The right answer right now is no, you don't want to do that, right?
No, I've already done it. I don't want to take too much credit. I have a great staff.
But I guess my point is, all that takes a toll. Do you have the mental and physical capacity to do it for another 4 years?
I believe so. I wouldn't be running if I didn't think I did. Look, I'm running again because I think I understand best what has to be done to take this nation to a completely new level. We're on our way. We're on our way. And look, the decision recently made by the Supreme Court on immunity, the next president of the United States, it's not just about whether he or she knows what they're doing. It's not about a conglomerate of people making decisions. It's about the character of the president. The character of the president is going to determine whether or not this Constitution is employed the right way.
All right, Greg, what do you got?
Mark, to your point about not following up, this turns into a softball of a question here, this whole interchange. Stephanopoulos tries to reframe the question, but this guy, when he says another 4 years, he does that plaintiff wail again, trying to get him to answer. And then we hear a bunch of words that are interesting, because if you were interviewing Biden, you would ask a ton of questions, because he brings out the talking point about immunity as a way to tie it in somehow. I'm sure he was told, you need to bring this up because it's a hot button. Whether he says it's not about the person and whether he or she knows. Now, either one of two things. Either he's being so politically correct, he's not taking into account the current time, or he knows something we don't know. Maybe she is somebody he knows about. We don't. But he doesn't ask. He doesn't probe that because it doesn't seem like a question to him. I would. Then he says it's not about a conglomerate of people making decisions. I'd poke there. I'd say, what do you mean by that? And then he says the Constitution employed in the right way. My very constitutional sworn oath to protect it makes me want to know what that means. And I would have asked that question because that's why I'm wired. But one thing that's interesting is he shows more passion at that employed in the right way than he showed in just about anything else. So I think he misses an opportunity. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah. Look, that's my only point, actually, is that what he does there is a beautiful piece of rhetoric, I think, and I'll take you through it in a moment. But I think that's been delivered to him by his communications team. He presents it actually quite well. Of course, you're right. It doesn't actually really make sense, but as a piece of rhetoric, it's quite poetic. It's quite kind of beautiful. And so, I think Stephanopoulos would be wrong to pick him up on that, because he'll spoil a nice piece of TV. It was a nice moment. Here's what he says, and he leans forward. He gets right into that evangelistic mode. He leans right forward and he says, character of the president, and again, character of the president, so he reiterates that and uses the word character, will determine if the Constitution is employed the right way. So a lovely assonance between character and Constitution. Like, that's a beautiful piece of poetry. It's just, I think Stephanopoulos rightly just lets it hang there as he's just made a nice piece of rhetoric. Let's leave him alone for a bit and not go, what actually what are you talking about? What do you mean by that? Yeah, you're right, Greg. In one way, you're right, and in another way, it was the best piece of TV there. So let him have it.
Have it.
Chase, what do you got on this one?
It's like when the courtroom fell silent after, if the glove don't fit, you must acquit.
Yeah.
You got to be quiet for something like that. You got to give it some room, some breathing room. It is a lot of the same things here. There's a lack of fluency. There's hesitancy. There's faded and hanging facial expressions like we talked about earlier, and frozen gesture movements where a gesture will pause after he's done talking, and then the gesture will hang there in the air. We're going to talk about this in a bit, which we've seen increase a lot over the previous 3.5 years. That's all I got. Scott?
All right. You guys covered pretty much everything. I'll just go back to he's following that pattern, the structure of little bitty answer and then just a bunch of political rhetoric on the back end. Has nothing to do with the answer. So that's all I got.
I don't want to take too much credit. I have a great staff.
But I guess my point is, all that takes a toll. Do you have the mental and physical capacity to do it for another 4 years?
I believe so. I wouldn't be running if I didn't think I did. Look, I'm running again because I think I understand best what has to be done to take this nation to a completely new level. We're on our way. We're on our way. And look, the decision recently made by the Supreme Court on immunity, the next president of the United States, it's not just about whether he or she knows what they're doing. It's not about a conglomerate of people making decisions. It's about the character of the president. The character of the president is going to determine whether or not this Constitution is employed the right way.
Do you really believe you're not behind right now?
I think it's all pollsters I talk to tell me it's a toss-up. It's a toss-up. And when I'm behind, there's only one poll I'm really far behind. CBS poll and
New York Times and NBC both have you about 6 points behind in the popular vote.
That's exactly right. New York Times had me behind before anything having to do with this race. Had me behind 10 points. 10 points had me behind. Nothing's changed substantially in the New York Times poll.
Just when you look at the reality, though, Mr. President, I mean, you won the popular vote in 2020, but it was still deadly close in the Electoral
By
College.
7 million votes.
Yes, but you're behind now in the popular vote.
I don't buy that.
Is it worth the risk?
I don't think anybody's more qualified to be president or win this race than me.
All right, Mark, what do you got?
Yeah, well, Stephanopoulos jumps in here and helps him out. The kind of him. And so, it makes me worry a little bit about the bias of this interviewer and why they wouldn't let that run a little bit to see, where he goes with remembering these polls. He jumps in there, delivers him the answer, and then Biden, to his credit, goes, "That's exactly right." Like it was a test for the interviewer. I mean, that's brilliant. That is brilliant, because you could easily walk away from that going, yeah, Biden just congratulated him on getting one of these questions right. So beautiful reversal there. I don't like that the interviewer jumped in to help. I'm not saying, hey, make the guy suffer, but ultimately, I think the purpose of this interview, from a public point of view, I would think, is to help that public understand, is he fit to govern or not? There's a piece of public service going on here, and it can be worrying, I think, if it feels like there's another service going on there to something else. Concerns me a little. Greg, Chase.
That's fine.
Yeah, okay. Greg, what you got on this one?
Yeah, I'm just going to add one thing. I don't think he believes it's a toss-up, because when he does the hands up in televangels, he's doing the T-Rex version of that. His hands are here. His arms are against his torso. They're locked, creating an exoskeleton, and he's still doing the come on or the now look Joe Biden. I don't think he believes that for 1 minute. Chase, what do you got?
Well, he's struggling to answer here. He's starting one sentence and then another in his initial answer. So it's one sentence begins, and before it ends, another sentence starts over again. Then he says, there's only one poll I'm far behind. And then he lists 2 polls and struggles to remember the second poll. And he's struggling to get words together. He's talking about the New York Times poll. He's really confident in his answer about being more qualified to win the race here. He's very confident, and his sentence structure is perfect right there. He firmly believes this. His whole posture changes. His face changes. And this is the clearest sentence, most confident sentence we're hearing in a very long time here. I'm just saying on this interview. I train the U.S. Army PSYOPs, psychological operations operators, and this has almost all 7 hallmarks of a campaign to gradually loosen confidence in a leader before they're replaced. I'm just pointing that out. It actually has, just in the last 6 weeks, has followed every single one of the 7 steps in perfect order except step 7. And they did the first 6 in order, exactly following this checklist, and they are in and on, I would say, step 6 right now. And I wish I had time to go through the list, but it's a crazy list. Actually, should I go through just a couple little bullets here? So step 1, identify and exploit weaknesses. 2 is manipulate public perception. So this is controlling it using social media, all that stuff. 3, create internal division. So this is just fostering discord in the leader's party among their peers, their supporters, all that kind of stuff. There's a big list of stuff that goes underneath that. But 4 is amplify social unrest, exploiting social issues and grievances, funding and organizing protests and strikes, civil disobedience, that kind of stuff. And that goes a pretty long distance. 5 is discrediting achievements, undermining accomplishments by questioning legitimacy, impact, that kind of stuff. And then promoting alternatives is number 6. So introduce and elevating potential successors who kind of align with this desired agenda. And this is what our government does in other countries, just so you know, and they're experts at it. So this involves like using the media and public platforms to showcase their strengths and vision, creating a narrative that the current leader is obsolete and there's a necessary change. And step 7, and you can see this in every time that we've done this in the last 70 years, is stage a crisis. So engineer some kind of crisis or magnify existing ones. So that's the alternative there. Create some kind of sense of urgency and panic. People that are, the lower you are on Maslow's pyramid, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the more suggestible you are, period. There is no exception to that. So the more you're worried about something happening in your life, the more suggestible you become, and then you get the message. That's how the U.S. does this in other countries, and I'm weird. It's a weird feeling to see it, all those steps happening in perfect order in this campaign, just in the last probably 12, 13 months.
Do you really believe you're not behind right now?
I think it's all pollsters I talk to tell me it's a toss-up. It's a toss-up. And when I'm behind, there's only one poll I'm really far behind, CBS poll and
New York Times and NBC both have you about 6 points behind in the popular vote.
That's exactly right. New York Times had me behind before anything happened to do with this race. Had me behind 10 points. 10 points had me behind. Nothing's changed substantially in the debate, the New York Times poll.
Just when you look at the reality, though, Mr. President, I mean, you won the popular vote in 2020, but it was still deadly close in the electoral college.
7 million votes.
Yes, but you're behind now in the popular vote.
I don't buy that.
Is it worth the risk?
I don't think anybody's more qualified to be president or win this race than me.
If you can be convinced that you cannot defeat Donald Trump, will you stand down?
It depends if the Lord Almighty comes out and tells me that, I might do that.
Well, I mean, on a more practical level, Washington Post just reported in the last hour that Senator Mark Warner is assembling a group of senators together to try and convince you to stand down because they don't think you can win.
Well, Mark is a good man, but we've never had that. He also tried to get the nomination too. Mark and I have a different perspective. I respect him.
And if Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and Nancy Pelosi come down and say, we're worried that if you stay in the race, we're going to lose the House and the Senate, how will you respond?
I go into detail with them. I've spoken to all of them in detail, including Jim Clyburn. Every one of them. They all said I should stay in the race. Stay in the race. None of the people said I should leave.
But if they do?
Well, it's like, they're not going to do that.
You sure?
Well, yeah, I'm sure. Look, I mean, if the Lord Almighty came down and said, Joe, get out of the race, I'd get out of the race. The Lord Almighty's not coming down. I mean, these hypotheticals, George, but
it's not that hypothetical anymore. I grant that they have not requested the meeting, but it's been reported.
I've met with them. I've met with a lot of these people. I've talked with them regularly. I had an hour conversation with Hakeem. I had more time than that with Jim Clyburn. I spent time with many hours off and on the last little bit with Chuck Schumer. It's not like I had all the governors. I
agree that the Lord Almighty is not going to come down, but if you are told reliably from your allies, from your friends and supporters in the Democratic Party, in the House and the Senate, that they're concerned you're going to lose the House and the Senate if you stay in, what will you do?
I'm not going to answer that question. It's not going to happen.
What's your plan to turn the campaign around?
You saw it today. How many people do you draw crowds like I drew today? You find me any more enthusiastic than today? Huh?
I mean, I don't think you want to play the crowd game. Donald Trump can draw big crowds. There's no question about that.
He can draw a big crowd, but what does he say? Who does he have? I'm the guy supposedly in trouble. We raised $38 million within 4 days after this. We have over 1 million individual contributors. Less than $200. I've not seen what you're proposing.
You haven't seen the fall off in the polls. You haven't seen the reports of discontent in the Democratic Party, House Democrats, Senate Democrats.
I've seen it from the press.
All right, Chase, what do you got?
I'm going to go long on this. If y'all can forgive me, I just want to inform everybody watching. I want them to walk away from this video feeling more informed than 99% of our populace. But I want to talk to you about something called anosognosia. And anosognosia means that a person doesn't either realize or they deny having memory or cognitive problems, even if it's clear to other people. So they might refuse help thinking that they don't need it. And if you have a family member with cognitive decline, you have seen this without a doubt, especially in the beginning. People refuse help. They think you're being crazy. And sometimes they refuse medication, which can even make that worse. And this involves 3 of our brain regions. And I study this in depth a lot. And it involves first the prefrontal cortex, this front part of our head here. And this is where we have our self-awareness. And issues in this part of our brain can hurt our judgment and insight a lot. Then we have this, let's just take the overall right hemisphere, especially the right frontal and parietal lobes. It affects our insight. But most importantly, the most important thing that we're talking about here is something called the anterior cingulate cortex. And this is mainly involved in error detection. This is how our brain says an error was made. I made a mistake or something happened that shouldn't have happened. That's where we process all that information. And that this leads to compensatory mechanisms. So the brain starts to hide deficits from the person, making the person believe that they're fine. So there's psychological elements that go along with this, but we don't have a lot of time for it. But I want to tell you really quickly about the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex role in dementia. So the ACC is very often affected in dementia. I would say probably 99%. And here's why it matters. The first part is cognitive processes. This part of our brain is involved in attention and decision-making and error monitoring. Second is emotional regulation. So it processes how we feel and our emotions and motivation. And the third, and maybe most important part, is that this is the most crucial part for understanding ourselves, who we are, is all in this little anterior cingulate cortex. And there's a lot of structural changes that happen with dementia. First is this little atrophy that starts. The ACC shrinks in dementia, which means it's not like getting tinier like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. It's just getting less neurons. Fewer neurons reduce functionality. There's less activity in there. There's less stuff going on. And with these connectivity issues, there's disrupted connections with other brain regions. If I have a neuron shut down, whatever that neuron was connected to is no longer receiving a signal and starts getting a divorce from that other neuron. And if you look at Alzheimer's disease, there's plaques in the ACC that disrupt function. These plaques are called beta amyloid plaques. And if you're looking at frontotemporal dementia, we're having major behavioral and personality changes. And in Lewy body dementia, in the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, this is where we have a huge disruption in function that affects our cognition and our emotion. So our ability to detect an error starts to get deleted from our lives. So watching this and knowing this, it should make you more sad than angry. Scott, what do you got?
All right. When he says, after he says it's not going to happen, after Biden says it's not going to happen, we see that hypersalivation again coming out of the side of his mouth. Look really close on that. It glistens. When you see that, it's gross to talk about, but it's there. So check that out. Again, that goes back to the medication for Alzheimer's and dementia as well. So then George tries put it nicely when he compares the campaign crowds to his crowds to Trump's crowds. So he's trying to, in other words, he's kind of sticking it to him without saying he's sticking it to him. He says you don't want to go down that road. In other words, so that's another little cue that lets you know that this guy isn't all for President Biden on this. And then another thing, going back to what you're talking about there, Chase, the personality type changes. I don't think we've seen one of the personality things of rage, because I heard this thing on what was it, Morning Joe, where Joe Biden calls into that show and is talking to him about the debate and other things going on. And he gets mad and he's yelling on the phone. You should check that out if you haven't seen it yet. And it's kind of odd. I've never heard a president yell before. That's my first time. And Greg and I talked about it for a minute. Like, dude, you hear that phone call? Greg, why don't you go now and you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and more importantly to me, for just a minute, forget dementia, forget any kind of physiological change. This could quite easily be Kubler-Ross work. We always say that when you're in grief, starts with denial, then anger. Well, this is denial, not a denial. This is denial as hard as it gets. And when you're willing to say nobody can draw a crowd like me, you're willing to be so dissonant, you can suspend the fact that Trump has these giant rallies. I think he's in denial. And I think he may know something we don't know about what's coming behind the scenes and how real the fight is. So I think that rage would be the second step, Scott. And I think that's powerful. But there are a couple of things. I'm amused by an 81-year-old man saying, if the Almighty comes down here and tells me, that's bold. That's bold when you're 81. And it just is interesting for somebody to say that. His hands are back out. He's not T-Rexing now like he was doing earlier. His hands are back out. He's back up to that prepared stuff he's doing. When he says, I'm not going to answer that question, there's a couple of interesting things. The narrowing of his eyes, a slight grimace, and there's concern in the forehead when he says not going to happen. This is really interesting because even when he says it's not going to happen, you see him throw those teeth up again. He's a multi-use tool, a way to pause. And then he does genuine open hands out and his brow up, but you get this. You understand what I'm saying. But his forehead stays up, begging for approval. This makes him look weak and old. I don't think this was in his preparation. I don't think anybody intended this. Mark, what do you think?
I agree. It is very bold what's going on here. Matthew 4:7, Deuteronomy 6:16, do not test the Lord thy God. As the King James Bible, I think, would put it. So what's happening here? Well, why is that those verses there? Because, if you say, look, God strike me down if he doesn't want me to do this job. Yeah, okay, so I think I'm okay then. Because that's why you don't test that. Because the worry is that a negative happens and everybody goes, well, then that's God's way then. I mean, clearly that's okay. So he's given a hypothetical here, a hypothetical. And he answers the hypothetical with the supernatural by going, let's see if God comes down and pushes me out of office. It's not happened. So therefore, I'm going to keep on going. Of course, that's completely illogical. It was not so logical to do a hypothetical, but then to answer that with a supernatural idea, we've gone way out there, way out.
I think there were some leaders of other countries who have said that that's the only way that they'll leave office.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, look, the turkeys never vote for Christmas. So, and once you're in, the idea is to stay in. So I've seen it 100 times. You can advise people and go, look, now's the time to bow out. We'll create, a great event for you, a great legacy. And they never do it. They hang in and they hang in and they hang in. And you see it every time. I've never seen anybody in my lifetime. Well, actually, no, Blair did hand over, but that was a deal that had been done a lot earlier, and he stuck by that deal. Probably wasn't a good decision at the time because Brown didn't do that long, but he did stick to the deal that he would stand down and Brown would get it. But look, I'm not going to answer that question. It's not going to happen. is that confidence or is that belligerence? And to your point, Scott, I've heard that Morning Joe phone in, and it's pretty ranty. You do kind of go, wow, this is a senior phoning into the morning show and getting all ranty, getting all, and you want to go, Dad, get off the phone, man, get off the phone, go and ring up your sister and go, can you go round and tell Dad to get off the phone because he's rung up the morning show and he's having a big old rant down the phone. Get him off. Give him some sedatives and settle him down and stick him in front of the football match and he'll be all right. So look, I don't know whether this is true or not. I don't know whether God's going to come down and sort all this stuff out. I really don't know. But I wouldn't be testing that in front of the American public and evoking Matthew 4:7 and Deuteronomy. I wouldn't be evoking any of that. And I wouldn't be making ranty phone calls. Not that that's what we're really talking about here. And I wouldn't be wanting to be mistaken for being belligerent. And unfortunately, if it's confidence that he's showing here, it's very easy for that to get mistaken for belligerence. And it may well be belligerence from somebody who is going through those stages of maybe realizing somewhat the position that they're in, both potentially neurologically and also that the knives may well start coming out. And Caesar may well be done. Yeah, that's all I got on that one.
If you can be convinced that you cannot defeat Donald Trump, will you stand down?
Well, it depends if the Lord Almighty comes out and tells me that, I might do that.
Well, on a more practical level, Washington Post just reported in the last hour that Senator Mark Warner is assembling a group of senators together to try and convince you to stand down because they don't think you can win.
Well, Mark is a good man, but we've never had that. He also tried to get the nomination too. Mark and I have a different perspective. I respect him.
And if Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and Nancy Pelosi come down and say, we're worried that if you stay in the race, we're going to lose the House and the Senate, how will you respond?
I go into detail with them. I've spoken to all of them in detail, including Jim Clyburn. Every one of them. They all said I should stay in the race. Stay in the race. None of the people said I should leave.
But if they do?
Well, it's like, they're not going to do that.
You sure?
Well, yeah, I'm sure. Look, if the Lord Almighty came down and said, Joe, get out of the race, I'd get out of the race. The Lord Almighty's not coming down. These hypotheticals, George,
But it's not that hypothetical anymore. I grant that they have not requested the meeting, but it's been reported.
I've met with them. I've met with a lot of these people. I've talked with them regularly. I had an hour conversation with Hakeem. I had more time with that than Jim Clyburn. I spent time with many hours off and on the last little bit with Chuck Schumer. It's not like I had all the governors. I agree that the Lord Almighty is not going to come down, but if you are told reliably from your allies, from your friends and supporters in the Democratic Party, in the House and the Senate, that they're concerned you're going to lose the House and the Senate if you stay in, what will you do? I'm not going to answer that question. It's not going to happen. What's your plan to turn the campaign around? You saw it today. How many people do you draw crowds like I drew today? You find me any more enthusiastic than today? Huh? I don't think you want to play the crowd game. Donald Trump can draw big crowds. There's no question about that. He can draw a big crowd, but what does he say? Who does he have? I'm the guy supposedly in trouble. We raised $38 million within 4 days after this. We have over 1 million individual contributors. That's less than $200. I've not seen what you're proposing. You haven't seen the fall off in the polls. You haven't seen the reports of discontent in the Democratic Party, House Democrats, Senate Democrats. I've seen it from the press.
All right. We've had a good look at the behavior and body language in this a bunch of clips, and we're going to go around and talk about it. And today we've got a special guest with us, James Pyle. It's the guy we're talking about all the time, saying you need to get his books and we refer to him. That's him. Wave, James.
Hey, guys.
Right there. Not that you couldn't tell the difference. All right, Mark, what have you seen so far?
Yeah, look, I'm going to go back to what I've said earlier, which is we can speculate all we like about neurological decline, and we might be right and we might be wrong, and you can decide that. But it really doesn't make a lot of difference because the American people are going to have a vote very, very soon. And what they want to be seeing is, are both candidates capable? I mean, forget policy, forget character. I mean, don't forget that policy and character are important, but ultimately there is this element within this election of, is there a capability there or is there an incapability there? And I think on this particular interview, just like the debate that went on, I don't think the American people will have seen enough, I think, my personal opinion, to make them confident about Biden being fit. But I could be wrong, because eventually we will see the results. We will see the results. We will see what happens. And that's the great thing about elections, is that there's a result and there's no second place. There's a winner. Everybody else loses. Chase, what do you got on this one?
Yeah, when it comes to interviews and just overall interviewers in general, this guy is the GOAT. So he's one of the best in the business. And I couldn't help but wonder, is this some kind of piece to set something up for the future? So like, let's get the sheep all in the same line to think the same thing. But who knows? We'll see. And maybe I'm wrong for even wondering that. Curiosity killed the cat. So, James, what do you got?
Well, I've got two things. First of all, we've watched this interview in its entirety, and you guys have pieced it, together for this program. But in my research that I do for my animation books, I do isolation, and if I watch something without the sound, I listen to something without the video. And if you watch this interview without the sound, and then do it with only the sound, you will hear and you will see troubling things and uncomfortable things that should let you know a little bit more about how you should make your assessment. I'm not saying he, like you guys say, that we can assess anything about his condition, but I can tell you that the political stuff that Chase mentioned that we're seeing all around in the context of everything is an indicator. And in my years as a pastor and my years working in the funeral industry, I've seen a lot of people hear a terminal diagnosis and their reaction to that and how to help them with that or deal with them that. And of course, the very first thing is denial. And we're there. Next thing is Dr. Kubler-Ross. Greg, you mentioned her, the death and dying, and there's 5 things. And so I just want to finish that list, because the denial's there, we see it. The anger from the phone call you mentioned is there. And then the next thing that comes with this presidential terminal diagnosis is bargaining. And they're talking to everybody's getting together, and they're going to be shaking hands and patting shoulders and making decisions. And he's going to be bargaining, and the family's going to be bargaining. And then depression is the next to the last thing, where we're actually acknowledging really what's going on, really what's happening, and then acceptance. And when that acceptance happens, we'll see a political event. Don't know if it's going to be sooner than later, but it's of interest to all of us who care about the state of politics here. Thank you for allowing me to be an audience today and to share some things that I have thought and listened to from you guys.
So Jim, great to have you. And from my angle, 2 things. We always say nobody exists in a vacuum, and how people around you treat you is a great indicator. Stephanopoulos is in the room with the guy. Watch his decaying attitude toward Biden. To that last clip, go back and watch And that intro, just that piece where he's asking him questions, it's like he's talking to a child. You don't infantilize people who you see as peers or superiors. You do it to people you see as weak and faltering. And that's what he's doing. Listen to his voice. And my last thing is, if this were my dad, I'd take his keys. Scott, what do you got?
Yeah, I agree. Well, there's a huge difference between President Biden now and in the debate, like we talked about at the very beginning. He's a little more lucid, I guess you'd say. He's there. We're still seeing a lot of the same things, that blank stare. We're hearing the smushing together of words and sort of search for words and sentences and those types of things. And his voice isn't as faulty, isn't as whispery as it was, that monotone hypophonia. It's not as bad, but he's been rested. And I would say this was probably in the morning when this happened. The earliest part of the day he could get there for this, since he would be as rested as he possibly can. His eyes are a little bit wider. His blink rate is actually up compared to what it was in the debate, which is surprising because the debate with all those hot lights and all the stress and all that, you'd think it'd just be going through the roof, but it was almost imperceptible. The blink rate was so low there. And his face isn't as sunken in as it was, and he looks a little fuller in the face, which I think is important because his color's better here as well. And one of the first things you look for if you're a doctor, I'm not a doctor, but when I hear doctors talk about, one of the first things they look for is the skin tone, how it looks. Are they pale? Are they red? Or how does it look? And his looks a lot better than it did on the debate. So I think we're seeing Biden's a little bit more rested, and he can speak a little bit better and function a lot better here. All right, fellas, thanks. This is another good one, and we'll see you next time.
The Behavior Panel.
There we go.
Thanks for joining us on WBLZ Jazz. Tonight we have Watercolor Jazz, another 51-minute uninterrupted music hour.
Jim was a DJ, Yeah.
I know. That's what I'm doing.
Push, keep running up that hill.
Handsome Jimmy James Owen Powell Esquire, just in the pretty face, wasted on radio. WBCE 1010 on your AM dial. Merle Haggard coming up after CBS News at the top of the hour.
That's beautiful. Let me tell you who got up next on the Pink Storm. We got WTBP all the way from Georgia, all the way from Canada, coming up from wherever Chase lives now. Where do you live in these days, Chase?